Whose side are you on? We're brought up to believe that everyone must choose a side, that there's a political spectrum that runs from one extreme to the other. You're either on the left or you're on the right. We accept this as true even without thinking about it because that's what we were taught in grade school. But what if this view is asked backwards, sideways, dead wrong? On the one side, the far right, you have Nazism and fascism and the kind of brutal nationalism, the tribalism of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. All of these far-right isms involve a lot of government control of the means of production. There's no freedom of speech, there's no freedom of association, there's hardly any freedom at all. But as we know from grade school, the body count on the far right is staggering. On the far left, you have socialism and Marxism and Maoism. All of these isms, we're told, are fundamentally different than those on the right, but when you think about it, they sort of feel the same. You still have government control of businesses and factories. You still have no freedom of speech, no freedom of association, no political freedom whatsoever. And the body count is equally staggering. This doesn't even make any sense. Is the middle of the road halfway between socialism and fascism? Between Marxism and Nazism? Of course not. That's silly. This phony left-right spectrum, it serves two functions. It creates two problems. First of all, it keeps us fighting with each other. When we otherwise might find common values, we might find common ground, we might agree on the rules that hold civil society together. Second, it allows people in the middle to claim some sort of moral superiority because they don't have an agenda, they don't have an ideology, they just want to do what works. We've heard this before.
I am not an ideologue. I'm not.
Technocratic progressivism, like espoused by Barack Obama and his cohorts, is still an ism. We'll get to progressivism in this series. Be on the lookout for this. When a politician starts talking about good government, they're really talking about more government. As it turns out, good government is a myth. In truth, this whole left-right thing, it's the wrong way to think about political philosophy. This celebrated middle of the road, where Republicans collude with Democrats to say bail out Wall Street, this can't be where the good stuff comes from, can it? Politics doesn't go from left to right, it goes from top to bottom. At the bottom are all of these despots that want to dictate the terms of your life, how you earn a living, what you're allowed to say in the public square, even what you're allowed to think and where you're allowed to worship. At the bottom, there is no liberty. There's only misery. At the top, we're going to talk about liberty. We're going to talk about people cooperating. We're going to talk about entrepreneurship and all of the really cool things that happen when people are left free. We're going to talk about why the rule of law matters so much, why the Constitution is designed specifically to restrain big government. Now, let's take a look at what a real political spectrum actually looks like. Here is an outline of all the systems of government, what I'm calling the deadly isms. At the bottom, you'll see the worst types of totalitarianism, National Socialism, Marxism, communism. I've always wondered why it is that communism is considered a far-left ideology and Nazism is far-right. Stalin and Hitler, they both seized private businesses, they both banned freedom of speech, they both killed millions of people. In terms of real people, are these two systems so different that they deserve to be on opposite sides of the political spectrum? I don't think so. All of these isms have one thing in common. They put somebody else in charge of your life, someone in charge of your happiness, someone who thinks they know better than you do, someone who is willing to use brutal, unchecked force, government force, to force you to comply. Of course, the experts, you know, the tenured professors and the really smart people in big media, they'll never admit this. Self-styled smart people think that socialism in practice is sometimes spiraled out of control, but the aspirations are so noble. If we could just get it right next time, try one more time, it'd be all unicorns and rainbows. Nothing to do with military dictators or fascist regimes. We aren't typically taught about the atrocities committed in the name of some noble ideal, some ism that was more important to achieve than the body count of innocent victims felled along the path to righteousness. You see what's going on in Venezuela today? Have you ever been told about what happened when Chairman Mao imposed his Great Leap Forward in China? Did you know that the bloody mess in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge was the product of Marxist professors and idealists? Maybe not. I'm guessing you haven't heard these stories before, but this stuff is important. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. The history of the deadly isms is bloody beyond belief, and there are millions of people around the world suffering because we haven't learned these lessons. That's right, we are absolutely going to go there. It's going to get really uncomfortable because the deadly isms at the bottom of the spectrum, it's the worst of man's inhumanity to man. As we move upward, we see things like democratic socialism. Bernie Sanders says it's different than regular socialism, that it's kinder and gentler. It's not like a dictatorship at all. But is it really different? Or is this just plain old socialism with a smiley face? And then there's corporatism. This is big business in cahoots with big government, fixing prices, raising costs, screwing the competition. This is pretty much where we are today. Finally, at the top, we have liberty. We have freedom. We have free people coming together to innovate, to create, to solve problems together. There's no such thing as good government. There's only limited or unlimited government. And this whole left-right thing, it's an illusion. The political spectrum that I'm interested in is one that separates authoritarians from those of us that believe in liberty. And that earlier question I asked, whose side are you on? It was a trick. There are no sides. How about this? I'll be on your side as long as you don't hurt people and you don't take their stuff. In this series, we're going to take a look at all the deadly isms and see how they've shaped the world as we know it. We'll look at socialism and communism, but we'll also look at fascism in all of its horrible ways. We'll get a bead on the style of democratic socialism that is so popular in Europe and the corporate cronyism that dominates government everywhere. In the end, I hope you'll see, as I have, that none of these isms have what it takes to save the world. Only freedom and voluntary cooperation can do that. Socialism is not cool. Socialism kills. I've looked at a lot of social media arguing with my contention that the body count from socialism is unprecedented in world history. They're wrong and I'm right. Let me name a few names. Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, 67 million people dead. Mao Zedong, the great Chinese experiment in socialism, killed anywhere from 38 million to 45 million, depending on the estimate. Kim Jong-un, his father Kim Jong-il, 1.7 million. These are mass murderers who set out to create a socialist utopia. If you take the body count, conservatively estimating about 100 million people, take those corpses, the victims of socialism, line them head to toe, one next to the other, and circle the globe, you will circle the globe almost 4 times. Socialism kills. To keep you is no benefit. To destroy you is no loss. In the 1950s, students started gathering in Paris. They were reading Karl Marx. They were forming book clubs. They were trying to come up with a better version of society, one that moved away from the division of labor, one that moved away from the capitalism in the big cities that they so despised. One student actually wrote a dissertation on how you would return to the agrarian society that they all dreamed of. One of those students would change his name to Pol Pot. He and his colleagues formed a new political party, a takeover in Cambodia. They called themselves Khmer Rouge. They proceeded in 1975 to implement these lofty ideas. They started herding people out of the cities into the farmlands, forcing people that had no idea how to farm to work the land. Some people were executed because they refused to do so. Other people died in the fields. They were called the killing fields. And many, many more people simply starved because the new model did not work. In Cambodia, under Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, 1 out of 4 people in that country died in less than 4 years. Think about that. Think about 1 in 4 members of your family dying because of an experiment. Think about 1 in 4 people in your community slaughtered because of a bad idea. This is socialism in practice. Socialism kills. Hi, this is Matt Kibbe, and I want to talk to you today about socialism. The S word is all in the news. Chris Matthews spent a lot of time last week trying to get Hillary Clinton to explain the difference between being a Democrat and being a socialist. Bernie Sanders is nipping at her heels in Iowa and New Hampshire, and he's a qualified socialist now. He's a democratic socialist. And I wonder what that means. This seems to be the ongoing rebranding of the big government crowd. When I was a kid, they were liberals. And over time, the word liberal became the L word. You weren't allowed to use it anymore. And liberals became progressives. Progressives, of course, go back to the late 1800s when it was a very authoritarian, very top-down, very elitist philosophy that literally believed that some people were smarter than the masses. That's where we are today, and apparently progressives not radical enough. So now Bernie Sanders is a socialist, but a democratic socialist, and I wonder what the difference is. A socialist, by definition, is someone that wants to see the elimination of the monetary economy, the elimination of prices, and literally the elimination of private property. It's always been this utopia sort of thing that's never been achieved by anyone. But to get from here to socialism requires a lot of centralized power. You have to give up your liberty. You have to give control to government to rearrange things from the top down. In practice, that's been a disaster. In practice, that's killed millions of people. In practice, it's led to abject poverty and all sorts of problems across the world. So now we're not socialists anymore. We're democratic socialists. Democracy, to me, means disintermediation. Democracy means shifting power away from government back to the people. Democratic socialism can't possibly mean that. At best, it can mean the majority of the people that show up to vote taking stuff from the other people that didn't win that vote. That's no different in practice than plain old socialism. Socialism kills. We've been talking about this in a series of videos, but today you don't need to look back in history to understand the meaningful and devastating impact that socialism has. Just a few years ago, when Hugo Chavez, the dictator of Venezuela, the socialist of Venezuela, passed away, Jimmy Carter celebrated his life and lectured Venezuelans, you should respect Hugo Chavez because he cared about the poor. Well, look at Venezuela today and look at the fruits of socialism, and you will see that the working poor, the unworking poor, anybody that is trying to feed their family is in dire straits in this tragic country. You can't get food. You can't get diapers. You can't even get toilet paper. Most devastatingly, you can't get beer to live through this socialist hellhole. How did this all happen? It started with a theory that capitalism is bad, a theory that private property and a division of labor is bad. One of the first things Hugo Chavez did was seize the land. He seized over 1,000 industrial enterprises, nationalizing them. He took over the energy grid. He took over the production of oil, which is today the only way that Venezuela generates revenue. All of this is now a disaster. There are people in the streets, there are people starving, and it started with an idea, a wicked idea, socialism. Hashtag socialism kills. What's up with all of these self-styled quasi-intellectuals who are using their goofy socialist ideas to experiment on real people like we're guinea pigs in a habit trail? It happened in Cambodia, where Pol Pot used his Marxist professor's musings to experiment and ultimately kill 1 in 4 people in just a couple years in his country. It's happening in Venezuela today, where Nicolas Maduro has adopted his own guru, a guy named Alfredo Serrano, who Maduro calls the Jesus Christ of economics. Frederick Hayek, of course, would call that the pretense of knowledge, and Hayek warned about intellectuals and socialism. He called them second-hand dealers in ideas, generalists that assumed that they knew everything, but really didn't know much about anything. And yet it's these second-hand dealers in ideas who drive public opinion, who continue to test failed ideas, who continue to lead to starvation and economic disaster. Serrano, for his part, is the architect of the wall that is keeping Venezuelans from buying food in neighboring Colombia. He is the architect of the idea that the problem with the food supply in Venezuela is not the lack of food, it's a lack of efficient distribution, it's a lack of government control. Second-hand dealers in ideas? No thanks, those ideas kill. Why is it that the very first thing to disappear under socialism is freedom of expression, new music, and disruptive rock and roll? I was contemplating this reality as the Rolling Stones performed in Cuba for the very first time since they were formed in 1962. Why? Because rock and roll was banned by Fidel Castro when he took over in 1959. Fidel Castro called rock and roll the music of the enemy. If you were caught playing the Beatles, you could be arrested. If you had long hair like some kind of a rock star, you could be beaten and jailed, maybe sent off to a work camp. As late as 2008, a Cuban punk band was actually put on trial for social dangerousness and perverting communist morality. This is crazy, but censoring music, banning music is really about control. Socialism is all about a central plan imposed by force from the top down. Socialism is about conformity. Music is all about the individual. It's all about being different. It's all about expressing yourself, being free to disrupt the status quo, free to challenge authority. Can't get no satisfaction in socialism. But with liberty, I know it's only rock and roll, but I like it. Yes, I do. Have you ever thought about what you would do to survive the zombie apocalypse? I think one of the reasons that The Walking Dead is such a compelling show is its exploration of the dehumanizing effect that the end of the world has on the characters. Luckily, it's all fiction, right? Tragically, not really. In Mao's brutal experiment in socialism in China, so many millions of people starved that entire villages were wiped out. It was the end of the world. Government records smuggled out of that country
document thousands of cases of cannibalism. People were willing to do anything to survive. People were so desperate for food, they began preying on the weak. They would dig up fresh graves. Parents would trade their children to other parents so that they would not have to eat their own. Later, during Mao's Cultural Revolution, cannibalism was used to control people. The Los Angeles Times tells the story of a Red Guard soldier disemboweling one young man who was deemed an enemy to the socialist cause. His heart and his liver were pulled from his corpse, and the villagers fed on it. Because the boy was an enemy of Mao's regime, he had to be eaten. It was a symbol of loyalty to the Socialist Party. Can we learn from history? When things get desperate enough, socialism turns humans into zombies. Socialism kills.
History repeats, and socialists always grab the guns. In 2012, socialist dictator Hugo Chavez decreed that no citizen of Venezuela would be permitted to own a weapon or even ammunition. His goal was explicit: disarm the public. Current socialist dictator Nicolas Maduro has decreed that he will double down on the Chavez policy, publicly seizing weapons and destroying them in a square in Caracas. The message is clear. History repeats. In 1974, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, once they took power, proceeded to disarm every Cambodian, going from village to village, knocking on doors. One woman tells the story of soldiers showing up at her doorstep. She was told that she no longer needed weapons because the government was now there to keep her safe. Of course, over the next 4 years, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge proceeded to slaughter 1 in 4 Cambodians. Some publicly assassinated for being disloyal to the government, others worked to death, others simply starved. History repeats. In Venezuela today, the gun grab follows draconian policies that have blocked moms from crossing into Colombia to get food for their children, has followed a socialist government military takeover of the food supply. Now, if you want to feed your children, you have to prove that you are loyal to the Maduro government. History repeats itself. I wonder why we don't learn from history. Socialism kills. On one side, the far right, you have fascism and that sort of totalitarianism. It's very nativist, it's very authoritarian, it's very controlling of how we live our lives. On the other side of the spectrum, let's say the left, is socialism. And of course, socialism in the original conception was going to morph into communism. And actually, in the words of Frederick Engel, one of the co-authors of the Communist Manifesto, he promised that the state would wither away under socialism. Notice that on the far left, it feels like the intentions are better. It feels like it's a little naive, but maybe, just maybe, we could get to that place where we would take from everybody according to their ability and give according to need. Well, guess what? It's not fascism versus socialism. An honest political spectrum would lump all of the isms, all of the authoritarian, top-down, big government approaches, murderous approaches, Islamofascism, communism, socialism, Nazism, all really bad stuff, belongs on one side of the spectrum. On the other is liberty and cooperation and freedom and people coming together to solve problems and to do things that we couldn't do together. If you look at the political spectrum that way, it makes a lot more sense.
Bernie Sanders wants to give you a lot of free, and he's going to pay for it with other people's money. He made a lot of news the other night declaring boldly that he would raise taxes. Yes, he would. And I was thinking about that in the context of Margaret Thatcher's famous quote. She said that the problem with socialism is that eventually you will run out of other people's money. Bernie Sanders says that there's lots of other people's money out there that can be redistributed. It can be spent on free health care, it can be spent on free education, free child care, more roads, fill in the blank, whatever it is you want, Bernie Sanders has the answer. The problem is $18 trillion in new spending can't possibly be paid for with higher taxes. Currently, we raise about $3 trillion a year total revenue from all tax sources. If you were to confiscate the entire wealth of every American that makes over $1 million a year, take it all, 100% confiscatory taxation, you would still only end up with about $600 billion. So we're really short, and we're going to drive up the debt. So if we don't use taxes to pay for Bernie Sanders' free, what are we going to do? We're going to borrow more money. Borrowing, of course, puts pressure on the dollar, puts pressure on the Federal Reserve to monetize that debt. It's the ultimate way that we steal money from poor people to give to rich insiders in Wall Street, to give to rich insiders in government. So my message to Bernie, Google Margaret Thatcher and realize that eventually you will run out of other people's money.
Marxist revolutionary Che Guevara died 50 years ago today. And if you aren't paying close enough attention, you would be forgiven for thinking he's some kind of a freaking saint. A new stamp has been issued with his image in Ireland, and statues of Che litter the world's city squares, particularly in Latin America. And those t-shirts. Search for Che Guevara t-shirts on Amazon and you get 798 choices. But Che Guevara was a stone-cold killer. He was chief executioner in Fidel Castro's bloody socialist regime, a reign of terror killing some 77,000 innocents. Here's what he himself said about his role. This is a revolution, and a revolutionary must become a cold killing machine motivated by pure hate. On his murderous legacy, Thor Halvorsen, president of the Human Rights Foundation, does not mince words. The Cuban Revolution, under the direction of Guevara, saw the rise of forced labor camps, which gave way a few years later to full-scale concentration camps. These were filled with dissidents, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Afro-Cuban priests, and anyone else who had committed crimes against the new moral revolution. So now you know. Socialist intellectuals will apologize for Che Guevara. It was for the greater good, they say. That's repugnant. Che was a killer. Socialism kills.
People in Venezuela who have never spent a day of their life on a farm may soon be forced by the government to work the farmlands. President Nicolas Maduro has decreed that anybody could be drafted for up to 60 days to help increase aggregate food output. Amnesty International says that this is just forced labor by some other words, but aren't we really talking about slavery here? This is a classic socialist strategy. As things start to unwind, governments start to enforce, by dictate, at the point of a gun, forced labor. History repeats itself. The same strategy was used by Fidel Castro to force his people to work the sugar fields. It happened under the Khmer Rouge as Pol Pot insisted that production quotas were not met because farmers were being disloyal to the socialist dream. Of course, it happened in China, where Mao succeeded in starving some 45 million people by trying to manage, by trying to force, by trying to enslave his people. Socialism always kills.
Venezuelan bakers have been caught baking brownies. Venezuelan Socialist President Nicolas Maduro is sending in troops to keep order and punish dissenters. What is their crime? Are they planning a coup? Is it a revolution? No, it's something apparently far, far worse. Venezuelan bakers have been caught baking brownies. I'm not making this up. It's the latest chapter in Venezuela's socialist experiment gone wrong. Tragedy is now farce. The Venezuelan government wants to control the price of bread, keeping it artificially low despite high demand. Bakers can't make enough money to keep baking bread, so they bake other things. Things like brownies, where they can charge whatever they want. Baking brownies, bakers have an incentive to keep baking, which means they bake more, and consumers can actually keep getting the food they need to live. Maduro's socialists, so dangerously naive, don't like this at all, and they intend to fix it at the point of a gun. They think prices are arbitrary, the result of greedy capitalists trying to exploit workers. But prices are essential to keep allocating the resources that feed people. When you do away with prices or try to control them too rigidly, the economy stops, which is precisely what's happened in Venezuela. Now, instead of using resources productively, the government is actually using military thugs to arrest bakers for not baking enough bread. So the people go hungry. This is socialism in practice. Socialism kills. Want to learn more? There's plenty more socialism on CRTV. Well, not exactly more socialism, but more videos about socialism and how much it sucks. You know what I meant. Sign up today with the discount code KIBBE, that's me, and save $10 on a 1-year membership. There's no food in Venezuela. People are starving. The Venezuelan people are pouring across the border into Colombia to find groceries to feed their children. What's so frustrating about this story is that we saw it coming for years and years and years. The socialist model always breaks down. People always starve because there's never enough of other people's money. Remember years ago, Hugo Chavez nationalized the farmlands. He nationalized the production of food, and the production of food collapsed. It always happens that way. Next, when oil prices collapsed, they started inflating their currency, the bolivar. They started producing more and more easy money, which raised the prices of food. It made it more difficult to import food from other countries, and this is where we're at today. People are starving because socialism fails. Socialism kills more babies than even war. Don't get me wrong, war is awful. But the Wall Street Journal reports that in war-torn Syria, fewer babies die than because of socialism in Venezuela. Let me say that again. Socialism kills more babies than even war. How can that even be possible? As it turns out, economics matters, policy matters, wealth creation matters. Wealthier countries have healthier babies. Zimbabwe is falling apart. With so many people fixated on the socialist tragedy unfolding in Venezuela, not enough people are paying attention to 92-year-old Marxist strongman Robert Mugabe and the tragedy unfolding in Zimbabwe. Since elected in 1980, Robert Mugabe has employed the most brutal tactics to cling to power. Tribal genocide, women gang raped, opponents tortured, even burned alive, and political opposition beaten, jailed, and even murdered. It wasn't supposed to be this way. The new Zimbabwe was going to be the dream of democratic socialism, but it didn't work out. Tell me if any of this sounds familiar. The democratically elected Mugabe quickly consolidated power, turning his prime ministership into a dictatorship. Farmlands were nationalized in the name of racial justice, but food production and supply immediately collapsed. This was followed by policies of broader wealth distribution, price controls, and rampant inflation. Mugabe himself describes his policies as an economic war to transform the means of production. But for all of his socialist rhetoric, Mugabe is really just about power. As he himself brags, "I am the Hitler of the time. Let me be Hitler tenfold." Just like in Venezuela today, Robert Mugabe is facing a popular grassroots uprising that could finally unseat him from power. But like in Venezuela, the government in Zimbabwe is prepared to do anything to maintain its power. Socialism kills. It started several months ago. A man was accused of stealing $5. He was surrounded by a mob of people. He was slashed. He was doused in gasoline, and he was set on fire. Things in Caracas, Venezuela have gotten much worse today. Moms are waiting in lines, literally collapsing, hoping for food that never arrives for their children. Men and women are literally hunting cats and dogs, looking for some way, any way, to feed their families. This is socialism in practice. Socialism kills. As Venezuela continues to spiral into complete economic chaos, Nicolas Maduro, the socialist president of that country, is facing a popular uprising from people who are starving and panicked. The signatures, according to election officials, have been gathered to allow for a recall of Maduro ending his term prematurely should it be successful. But don't hold your breath. Under socialism, power is always maintained through military control and brute force, and Nicolas Maduro understands that. Amid widespread hunger and panics, he has sealed the border so that moms can no longer cross into Colombia to get food for their children. He has put the military in charge of food distribution, and reports from Vice News suggest that the only people that qualify for food subsidies are those who can demonstrate their loyalty to the Socialist Party. This is how socialism works. It's going to devolve into a power struggle, and I'm guessing that the guys with the guns, the guys in charge, the socialists will win this fight. When government controls the food supply, socialism kills. Socialist dictator Kim Jong-un has assassinated one of his top advisors. His crime? Bad sitting posture. I am not making that up. Further investigations by socialist leaders revealed that the guilty official was also guilty of anti-party, anti-revolutionary agitation. In December of 2013, Kim Jong-un assassinated his uncle, his closest advisor, his number two. When his wife complained about it, he poisoned her as well. In 2015, Kim executed his defense minister, actually using an anti-aircraft gun, forcing other government officials to watch the execution. Do you have any idea how big an anti-aircraft gun is, or what it would do to a person? Cuckoo Kim, very experimental when it comes to assassinating people. He prefers flamethrowers. Since 2000, Vice News reports that the socialist regime in North Korea has executed almost 1,400 people. Of course, socialist policies have killed millions more through starvation, through control. Kim Jong-un is bat crazy. and socialism kills. The situation in Caracas, Venezuela continues to deteriorate as socialist dictator Nicolas Maduro seems willing to do anything to cling to power. He's particularly worried about a grassroots uprising, a popular recall, and a massive protest planned for later this week that could depose him from his perch of power. Not coincidentally, my friend Ian Vasquez at the Cato Institute reports that freedom activist and a key organizer of that protest and that recall, Jan Goycochea, has been kidnapped by the Venezuelan government. Jan, of course, was the 2008 winner of the Milton Friedman Prize in Individual Liberty, put out by the Cato Institute for his defense of liberty and his grassroots organizing against Hugo Chavez. This is what happens when socialists get desperate. Any sense of free speech? Out the window. Any sense that civil liberties matter at all? Out the window. Let's hope that Jan is freed soon. Let's also hope that the people of Venezuela are freed soon of this socialist nightmare. Socialism kills.